So, for another episode of Health and Wellbeing, I guess. Still focusing primarily on mood dysregulation. How else I want to say that? This time, it's a short, quick one that I was reminded of recently, where the technique I use for this one is really more of a kind of crunch the numbers kind of thing. There's a tendency when dealing with anxiety to assume the worst, even if improbable, will happen. You're afraid you're going to lose your job because of not being able to help a customer in a certain way, or you're afraid somebody you care about is going to leave you because you didn't show up to their casual gathering with friends at a restaurant, and that you think they're going to abandon you because you don't show up all the time. Just little things where you jump to a conclusion that is disproportionate to the actual amount of consequence to the events. And for me, I don't generally go that far with some things, but there are certain things, particularly health complications for me in the past. As I struggle with some of my conditions, I tend to start to mount evidence that it's going to just continue to get worse indefinitely, and I'm going to suffer a long, protracted decline over a period of years. That may be the case, I don't know, but the thing I found that helps me deal with that kind of mindset is to sort of look at, I call it crunching the numbers. And basically, the example that came up a few days ago was somebody else was talking about they had an interaction where they expressed a certain amount of vulnerability and openness that they don't generally express. And they hadn't received a comforting response. And so they had this anxiety that it was going to come back and cost them their job, cost them friends, cost them a relationship. And the way I have to look at this is, okay, so you look at the possible outcomes of the situation. If you act in a way that is vulnerable, that makes you feel vulnerable, you have to look at it and say, okay, so either they hear what I'm saying and they acknowledge the feelings and appreciate that and are very supportive. They hear what I'm saying but don't know how to respond to provide support. They want to support, but everything they can think to say is trite, so they don't say anything because they don't know how to respond. They hear what you have to say and had never thought that was possible, and now they have to really think about what that means. And so they're not aware that they're leaving you feeling like you're hanging. They hear what you have to say, but can't really understand it and think that if they just give it time, you'll not bring it up again. They hear what you have to say, but disagree with the premise, but don't want to fight about it because it's not as important as just being friends. Or they vehemently disagree with you and they're questioning your relationship at this point. And so when you look at that list of possibilities, you really have to stop and look at them and say, one of those possibilities is painful. Maybe the last two of those possibilities are painful. But the vast majority of consequences are probably decent. They're good. They're markers of a good relationship with another person, and they're valid ways of not knowing how to go forward from there. So you've taken those numbers, you've crunched those numbers, and you see the majority of the outcomes are likely not as catastrophic as you think they are. Okay, so the next step in the process is to say, if somebody vehemently disagreed and felt it was relationship ending and was worthy of confrontation about, then you would have seen a confrontation in a short period of time. In the vast majority of those cases, you would get an immediate response telling you you're stupid, this is a horrible idea. If you haven't had that immediately, then you know it's less likely. And as more time passes, the rate at which it decreases as a possibility, or in this case, that way, is sort of exponentially growing. 3 days after you've said something that you're afraid is going to destroy your relationship with somebody, if they haven't said something to you, odds are pretty good that it's not as big a deal as you think it could get to be. And so you're starting to weed away some of those less likely scenarios. And then in the end, you have to really stop and ask yourself, how important is this that I feel the need to keep worrying about how other people think and feel? If it's something you've done to express yourself and you're worried that your expression of yourself is going to have consequences for you, how long before you start to question whether or not that person has that much control over how you feel about yourself? You have to accept sometimes that not everybody knows how to handle those situations, and is it something so catastrophic that it can destroy your relationship from your side, even if they don't feel it destroys the relationship from their side? Or can you kind of accept that it may take some time for other people to come to grips with what you have fought and struggled to come to grips with yourself? So, as you go through these things, you can kind of start to see, like, I felt vulnerable, I felt scared about the issue, and part of that was worrying about what this other person felt. And as time passes and you see that they're not going to throw it back in your face and they're not going to attack you for it, then you start to ask the question, well, even if they are struggling with this and are uncomfortable with the topic, is it something that is necessarily driving them away from me? Or will my continuing feeling of vulnerability increase that sense of division between us? And acknowledge that sometimes the thing that divides the relationship is your own reaction to your anxieties. And so accept when others may be working towards an understanding, and give them time to work towards that, and be supportive of them not really getting it at first. And when you look at it from those perspectives, those anxieties are anxieties about how we as people interact with one another and struggle to understand each other without hurting each other. And that's sort of how almost all human interactions are, is trying to not hurt each other while trying to understand each other's different perspectives and maybe not always succeeding. And so when you kind of break it down to those numbers, where each time the worst case scenario that's left is, can you come to an understanding about it and give it time to work out? And if you just kind of keep doing this every time you come across one of those worst case scenarios that's in your mind, and just kind of give the numbers of what's the probability that this is really the worst case scenario, and what mitigating steps are there within this kind of interaction that I can kind of give time to, and not force it to happen faster than it's able to accept. And by doing this in the past, I've found ways to kind of short circuit that anxiety, and just, I mean, I haven't had to deal with that particular anxiety in a long while, but it's a technique that I can sometimes apply to other things, where if you just crunch the numbers and you see how unlikely your worst fear is, and then just keep cutting it back to what's probably going on here, and learning to work within that framework, you'll oftentimes find that the majority of things are not as bad as you think, and they aren't as urgent as you feel they are, and you just give yourself time to work your way through them, and it helps immensely with anxiety. That was a bit of a ramble, but you guys see you next month.